do a brief welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I really have thought for a couple of years now that it's so important, knowing Wayne State School of Social Work's history and activism, that we reignite that energy here. It's certainly the time, and I think our students are hungry for it. And I appreciate our student organization, SWIFT, Social Work in Focus Transition Team, is student-led organization, and Andre is the chief of that organization, and they've been working really hard to bring activities and activism back to the school. So I am grateful for that, and I am very grateful for our presenters today to be able to bring some of their own history back to the school and to our alum. And I have to tell you a little story. There was an orientation this week with incoming MSW students, and we mentioned that this forum was going to take place, and there were many students who were asking for the link to this. They really want to be part of this. So we're grateful for the 4 alum that we do have, and I'll just quickly introduce this before turning it back to Takesha. We have Milt Tabor, Wayne State School of Social Work class of 1963. Norman Olshansky, Social Work class of 1971. Paul Hubbard, Social Work class of 1971 also. And Sarah Gleischer, class of 83, the youngster here, or at least from her graduation age. So thanks so much for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Takesha.
Thank you, Dean Kubiak. So today, what we're our roundtable discussion focuses on this historical context, as well as looking forward in terms of our social change, our social justice, and our obligation to our communities. So we know that this year has upended would be such a calm word. It has uprooted, it has challenged us, it has called us as a profession to task. And now, as we begin to emerge with newfound freedom of being able to walk around outside, but also feeling empowered and as it's related to those issues and those struggles that are most pressing around racial inequity right now. It's great to have us come together to really look at what is our battle plan, but also look at the historical context of how we got here as a profession. I always believe that it is great to draw from those individuals who have really paved the way for us in terms of social change, social advocacy, and really sustaining change in our community. So we're going to allow a roundtable discussion for some of our social work leaders to provide some insights around their experiences and engaging in their communities during times of crises. Our panelists come from a variety of walks of life, lived experiences, and after receiving their social work degrees have done many wonderful things in the community. So as the Dean mentioned, we have with us today 4 of our alums from the Wayne State University School of Social Work, and I'll do a brief introduction of each of them before I turn it over for them to do their initial discussions around their career choices, their path, and really their social justice and social action obligations. So first up, we have Milt Tabor, who is the former president of an American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the local union representing nonprofit social service workers, a former assistant education director of Michigan, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, a statewide council, and is the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America Atlanta chapter, and a writer. Once he concludes his speech, we will have Norm Olshansky, who's the former executive director of Common Ground and manager and consultant for nonprofit agencies in the United States, Canada, and Israel. Our third speaker will be Mr. Paul Hubbard, who's the managing partner of Trivium Community Economic Development, also a member of the Toledo Social Unrest Task Force, and the School of Social Work Board of Visitors member, and former president of New Detroit. And then concluding our panelists will be Sarah Gleischer, who is a School of Social Work Board of Visitors member, the former chief of staff for the late Mary Ann Mahaffey, a former policy, advocacy, and program director at a community mental health agency, and the former project manager for Beaumont Health. So Mr. Milt Tambor, I will turn it over to you. Yes, so Mr. Norm Olshansky, can we turn it over to you?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First of all, it's really a treat to be back, even if just remotely, and for you to have created this reunion for Milt and Ron and I. We were together 50 years ago and haven't really had any contact with each other since. I've been given a real limited time, so I'm going to jump right in, and I'll be referring to some notes in the interest of keeping on time. I think there's some feedback coming from Milt now. Anyway, let me start off by saying, as you all know, we're all products of our environment, our culture, and family upbringing. My early environment and culture included 2 parents who were in helping professions, the fact that I grew up in the highly segregated South during the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam protests. Social activism, human relations, and advocacy were part of my early DNA. Many major periods in my life affected how I then ended up at Wayne. I took a year off from undergrad school to be a VISTA volunteer. That was the Domestic Peace Corps at the time, working in the inner cities of Spanish Harlem, New York, and Roxbury, Boston, doing community organization of tenants who were in slums, working on tenant-landlord relations, and taking legal action with the help of Legal Aid Society against many of the slumlords. After completing my undergrad education, I decided I wanted to get a master's degree in community organization with public policy and community development focus. That led me to Wayne, which at the time was only one of 3 graduate schools that offered such a program in social work. While at Wayne, I had 2 excellent field placements, while at the same time I was working to support my family as I was going to school. My first year, I was a legislative aide to Senator Roger Craig, doing my field work in Lansing. My second field placement was with Milt at AFSCME, and I participated in several of those negotiations for nonprofits and social service workers. I do want to highlight a few lessons learned. First, ask questions. What you learn will open your mind to more questions. Challenge conventional thinking. Think out of the box. Be willing to take calculated risks. Focus on your personal priorities. What's important to you? And always consider ROI. That's a business term, as you know, for return on investment, but it applies to everything we do. It's that focus on return of investment on your time and resources. Your time and resources. Set goals and go for it. Now, I always saw my graduate experience as just being an obstacle course to get through. It did provide opportunities for networking, building relationships, and learning how to access resources going forward. I don't mean to minimize the academics, because what you'll learn in those classes will help you in terms of skill development, and most of the knowledge that you'll get from those classes will really not happen until you graduate and get into the real world. While at Wayne, I was president of the student body and served on several committees, including one that was involving other disciplines and other schools. While at one of those committees, a faculty member from the School of Nursing approached me at the end of the first year and asked if I might be interested in a summer job. That led me to be introduced to a group of 14 to 15-year-old teens and a couple of their parents. They were concerned about the impact of drug and the counterculture at that time, how it was having on their friends and themselves. As the old saying went, drugs, partying, rock and roll, and casual sex. What had been primarily a problem at the time in the inner city and Cass Corridor was then impacting the suburbs. I was hired to help the teens organize themselves, establish leadership, and create an organizational structure. That was the beginning of Common Ground. It wasn't easy. I was in my early 20s. It was like herding cats. We needed a safe and non-judgmental environment that was accepting to teens, many of whom were using and selling drugs. Some were runaways living on the streets, and others had an assortment of medical, mental health, and family issues. We were able to get use of a house in the city of Birmingham. Even then, it was an upscale community and not receptive to long hairs and druggies hanging out on our Common Ground porch. Several parents, however, did introduce me to some of the city fathers and the chief of police so that they could be assured that we were there to be helpful and not promote negative or illegal activity. We became a crisis center and youth programming center. We then added a free outpatient medical clinic and a legal clinic soon thereafter with the help of adult professional volunteers. We trained the teens as peer crisis counselors and provided a 24-hour-a-day crisis helpline and drop-in center. I continued to work full-time at Common Ground while in my second year of graduate school, mainly working when I didn't have classes on nights and weekends. And I stayed on with Common Ground for many years after graduation. Common Ground, as you may know, has now been in existence for over 50 years and is one of the major community mental health providers in Oakland County, serving the greater region. So what are one of the lessons I learned from Common Ground besides the experience itself? After I graduated, I was asked by the governor to sit on a task force for drug abuse treatment and prevention. At the time, we were concerned about the classification of a drug called methaqualone. We felt it needed to be a much higher classified drug. So I was asked to help to educate opinion makers in our community, in the community I was in, and also impact educating the media. So I arranged for a meeting with the editor of the local newspaper, which at the time was called the Birmingham Eccentric. I sat down with him for lunch one day. I went through all of the history of the drug, the problems it caused, the pharmacological background of the drug, how many people were dying from the drug, why it was important to change the way it was registered as a prescription drug. And when I finished my presentation, a very thorough presentation, I must add, he congratulated me, again, remembering that I'm in my early 20s at the time, and said, "Norm, you did a great job with that presentation, but you didn't really do your homework." And all of a sudden my heart dropped because I thought I really knew the subject. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, "You didn't do your homework about me." And then he went on to tell me that before I moved to Michigan to go to school, he happened to have been a state legislator and was involved on committees that dealt with drug abuse. and said that he, for a long time, had wanted that to happen and never could. And then we laughed about it a little bit and eased my embarrassment. And he went on to do some great editorials about the drug. Another chapter in my career was with the Virginia and North Carolina as regional director of the Anti-Defamation League, which got me back into more human relations, legislative advocacy, and countering hate and extremist groups. I even briefly went undercover in the Klan and had a lot of direct contact with some of the tele-evangelists in my region, including Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Jim Baker, and some of the problems that they were causing in the community among activists who were concerned about social justice. You can ask questions later if you want to know more about those interactions. Let me talk about another lesson learned. This was while I was working also with ADL as part of an interfaith council. One morning I got up and I was reading the paper and I saw a letter to the editor that was not only anti-Israel, which was very blatantly anti-Semitic. Now you can be anti-Israel and not be anti-Semitic, but this one went into the anti-Semitic zone and it got my blood boiling. Well, I walk into the meeting that morning of the interfaith group and I'm still boiling. And the first person I saw was the head of the statewide Greek Orthodox community. So I went up to him and I said, we were very friendly, we'd worked together and the like. I said, did you read that letter to the editor this morning about Israel? He said, you know, I didn't notice that. But did you notice the one about Cyprus? And I had not noticed that. The lesson learned. We see things from our own eyes. Things that might upset us, people may not be familiar with or not knowledgeable about or whatever, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions about people until we've had a chance to find out what they know, what they don't know, and give us a chance to educate them. Another social issue we addressed was prison reform. I organized a group of clergy leadership in Richmond who headed their denominations who were very influential in the community. We heard that there were problems in the maximum security prison and were able to arrange for a group of us to visit and speak to inmates directly. We saw a lot of mental health issues, racism, and other problems related to prisoner treatment. Following our visit, we held a press conference and submitted our concerns to the legislature. While all of the problems were not solved, many were addressed. Needless to say, it's still a work in progress, but also social activism did make a difference. I'm going to stop here in hopes that there'll be enough time for your questions following the other speakers.
I'm sure there will be. Thank you so much. I heard undercover work there, so I jotted down a quick question of my own. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that the great thing about that's the work that you've done is that it reminds us that we can have more than one thing that moves us to action. It can be multiple things. They can be simultaneously done. And I think a lot of times we struggle with what is that thing that we will do first. And I like the story that we can do a whole lot all at once. So we'll be circling back with some questions for you, most definitely. Mr. Milton, I believe we've got you unmuted now if you would like to go next.
Okay. Yes. It's special to be part of this program at this current time because we're in the midst of dramatic actions that are occurring throughout the country. And those actions are significant because they've heard the call for action. And so that's going to be the next generation of activists, along with the students that are here as well. It's special for me too, because I've been thinking about the questions of school, the impact that had on me. And I wrote a memoir this past summer called A Democratic Socialist 50-Year Adventure. So I've been wrestling with the questions that we're supposed to address here today. So it's special for me to be able to share some of that. I'm a child of the 1950s. So I was raised as in high school or as a teenager during the 50s, went to college in the 50s, and in the late 50s, I went to school of social work. Now, a couple of events in the 50s really shaped my world perspective, my world view. First of all, there was McCarthyism. The 50s were about repression, conformity, and the Cold War. And McCarthy represented all of that. Wherever he looked around, he saw a red menace, and he destroyed the lives of many people. And there was censorship as well. My favorite movie was The Adventures of Robin Hood, and I subsequently found out that the Indianapolis Textile Commission ruled that that was un-American. That was communistic because Robin Hood stole from the rich to give to the poor. And that was one of my favorite movies. So I had to deal with the fact that we were coming and dealing with a bully who was out to discourage dissent and would look at any kind of activism, whether it was civil rights or unions, as suspect. And so from that experience, when at the McCarthy hearings, he was found out to be incredulous, shameful, and the line that really said it all was, "Have you no decency?" And so for me, I vowed in a sense that I would stand up to any of those bullying tactics that would promote dissent. And it turns out, by the way, that his chief counsel was Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn was the mentor of the racist who is currently residing in the White House. Another event that impacted me was, as we move into the 50s, there was the Montgomery boycott, and the next year there was an action where a student was entering the school in Alabama, University of Alabama. That was Otheria Harris. And she had to deal with the resistance on the part of the segregationists and the blocks that were put in her path before she could even enter the school. And it reminded me in a small scale, a much smaller scale, that when I went to school, I heard epithets too. I went to a Jewish parochial school, and I was called a kike and a dirty Jew. So I kind of understood in a smaller scale what it meant to face bigotry and hatred. And the last thing in the 50s that really shaped me was a book that I read. It was a book by Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm was part of a social science group that focused in on issues of authoritarian ideology and authoritarian leaders. What was it that attracted people to those leaders and those beliefs? And so when I read the book by Erich Fromm, The Sane Society, he came up with a very clear picture. A sane society is a socialist society. And from that point on, without fully understanding what it meant to be a socialist, it made absolute sense to me. A sane society was a society that met the needs of the people in that society. So with that kind of background, I was ready to go into the School of Social Work at Wayne and try to improve the lives of people and make some kind of contribution to a bettering society. I went into group work because there was no community org sequence at that time. And there were a couple of things I learned as a result of going to school, which were rather significant. One was, as a group worker, we had to write records whenever we met with a group, explaining what we were trying to do during each session, the goals and the objectives, and we had to reflect on that with our supervisor on a regular basis. Now that was very challenging because every action you took or did not take had to be explained as part of the supervisory and education process. From that, I learned that when you go into meetings, it surely is important for you to know what you're going to do, what to expect, and to plan accordingly. The other thing that I learned was being exposed to different community than I had come from. I came from a Northwest Jewish community, and my field placements were in the Jeffries Project, in the Cass Corridor, one year, and another year it turned out to be in a African-American neighborhood near Hamtramck. And that was a new world that I was being exposed to, something that I had never experienced and something that I wanted to learn from. And I was fortunate that I was able to develop some relationships, and I spent some time in the African-American community and finding out then, this was in the middle 60s, that police harassment and police brutality was an issue. So we're going back, there's a long history as we all know. And the third thing I gathered was some of the faculty. I learned from them. David Weinman, human behavior. He had a very innovative approach to human behavior, new ways of intervention and working with children. That was kind of dramatic. Ike Krasner was someone who was involved in peace protests and organizing on that basis, and he filmed those actions and sharing that with us. That meant a lot. Now, there was one thing that I was not prepared for when I graduated from the School of Social Work. And what I found out was we're professionals, and I assumed because we had a degree that we would be treated a certain way, and that when you entered into the workplace, you'd be treated with some kind of respect. Well, that's not exactly what happened to me. And then I entered into a situation which actually changed my entire life. After several years working at a nonprofit agency, I assumed some more responsibilities as head of a day camp, and I went into the director to see if I could get a raise. I asked him, shouldn't I merit something more for the additional work that I was doing? Turned out there was another friend that I had working there, and we didn't even talk too much about salaries. That didn't even enter into it. But what I discovered is when we did share that information finally, it turned out he felt embarrassed because he made more than I did. I felt shamed because I made less than he did. There was no sharing of salaries. So I went in and I explained. Took me a lot of nerve to do that because this was my first job. And I said, could you consider giving me a raise based on the additional job responsibilities? And he said, what will stay with me for the rest of my life and really shape my career. He said, whenever we think you're ready, we will let you know. So there was no grievance committee. There was no personnel committee to review it. I didn't even know who the we was when he said, we'll let you know. The point was, this was paternalism to the extreme. It's on the verge of a dictatorship if you're talking about having any kind of say in anything. And I could not respect myself by staying there. So I left and I began to work with the United Automobile Workers Retiree Center. So I was working with retirees. These were retirees who had worked in the plants. This was a center that was in local 600 in Dearborn. And that was quite an experience for me because what I got to learn was the struggles that some of these workers had just to get a union. They were there when in 1937, there was an attempt to organize Ford workers, and Bennett and some of his goons came and beat up Walter Reuther and everybody around there at the Battle of the Overpass. So I heard those stories and I started to learn a little bit about unions. I had never known anything about unions. It wasn't part of my history. So that was very special. Then the other thing that I discovered was that at the agency, the workers were represented by a union. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. This was a union that had just formed in the early 1960s. And part of the reason it was able to organize was there was legislation passed in Michigan that allowed public workers the right to bargain, and the same held true for nonprofit agency employees. So I'm walking into a situation where there's bargaining going on to determine your wages, hours, and working conditions, and I decide I want to be part of that. So I joined the bargaining committee. And then revelations of all, we sit down and bargain, and we had an amazing director there. Her name was Frida Garrett. She came out of the Settlement House movement, and she would sit down and say, here's the pot of money that we have. How do you want to divide it? And that included her salary as well. Now, that's as transparent as can be, and we were able to set up a salary scale based on seniority and education. And so I became a firm believer in the process, the collective bargaining process, and the fairness that it could provide. Well, right around the same time, this is now 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. It turns out, if some of you remember or heard about it, he was going to lead a poor people's campaign, and he was getting ready to support the sanitation workers in Memphis. Not only getting ready, but he was there a couple of times to support them. The sanitation workers, those 1,100 workers, they were committed to getting union recognition, improve their working conditions. And so when he was assassinated, since that sanitation workers union was a part of our larger umbrella union, we wound up supporting them. And 4 days after the assassination, we took a bus and we went down to Memphis. This was to honor his legacy and to show support for the sanitation workers. And I will never forget that moment. That joined together the labor movement with the civil rights movement. And we marched in a silent march. Never been part of that. Nobody said anything. All you were able to hear were the sound of footsteps. And that made an indelible impression upon me. And it surely made me understand the need for workers to be connected up with each other and the connection between that and civil rights. The next year, in '69, I also was involved in becoming president of the union that was mentioned as part of my introduction. That was nonprofit agencies. So we had 500 workers working in these 15 agencies, and we called a strike in 1969. What was the strike about? We were trying to bargain contracts with each of these individual agencies. It might be a family service agency, a settlement house. And when we would sit down with the agency, they would say, I'm sorry, we don't have the money to do that. Our funding body, United Foundation, United Community Services, they're the ones that hold the purse strings. So whenever we tried to negotiate, we always came against that, the limitations that were praised by the funding bodies. So we did something rather dramatic. We wound up saying, well, if these funding bodies are determining the budgets of each of the agencies, maybe they should be sitting at the bargaining table as well. And so the strike was about getting these funding bodies to join at the bargaining table. We were not successful. And there were a couple of reasons we weren't, but key to it was we didn't have the critical mass. We didn't represent the majority of the nonprofit agency employees. Plus, there was something else I learned as a result of that. Part of the reason we weren't making any inroads with these funding bodies who refused to sit down and bargain, they said, that's not what we're here for. Part of the problem was they represented corporate interests. And there were no grassroots representation on these boards and these funding bodies. So we took a position that there should be greater grassroots representation on those committee and boards. And right now, when we talk and you hear teachers unions talking about bargaining for the common good, that's what unions, if they want to be dynamic, need to do. They need to not only represent the interests of their members, but the community as large as well, and a number of unions are doing that. In 1969, that's when the peace movement, anti-Vietnam War movement really impacted on me. I went to a NASW workshop on peace and disarmament, and I learned about the history of Vietnam. And that was mind-blowing to me, because I learned that there were Geneva Accords that the United States was party to it, and that there would be free elections. And it didn't happen quite that way. We supported the South Vietnamese. What were we afraid of? We were afraid of an election of Ho Chi Minh, a communist who would be the leader in that country. And it dawned on me as so obvious that we were intervening in a civil war and impinging on their sovereignty. And that led me to become very active in the Detroit Coalition to End the War. And we did speak outs, we did education programs, I spoke at campuses and local union halls. And there was a lot of sometimes tensions within the movement. That's one of the things I learned at that point. Sometimes when you have a movement, you have different wings to the movement. And so we had some folks who said, you should be more radical than you are, than just working with electoral issues, not just ending the war, but expanding it to other issues. So yeah, that's something that I learned to recognize. Yes, you will have to expect differences, maybe clashes. Hopefully they will not break up the movement, but they do cause some particular problems. I am thankful to the Michigan police and to Detroit police, because they provided a record. They did surveillance of all of the meetings that I went to and all of the other anti-war activists. And so I was able to get copies of those records, and that really was good for my memoir, because it kind of kept me up to date where I had been and which license plates had been in the same parking lot as mine. So that was the Vietnam War.
Mr. Temple, I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we definitely will be revisiting what we call in the School of Social Work a fireside chat. I think we need to really have you come back with our students, because I think there's such a rich history there as you discuss about what essentially is your legacy, this work that you've done, not only around intersections of those things that are your personal identity, but also how you look at your movements intersecting across issues, social issues. So we definitely we're going to have to revisit yours, that most definitely, because I think that story to tell is something that we find vital. And while we don't have the platform here to delve as deeply, we're taking notes, and I actually saw Andre taking some notes as well. So we most definitely, while we have to move on from here, we'll be circling back with some questions for you, most definitely. So next up, I want to turn it over to Mr. Paul Hubbard to give us his discussion.
Everything now. Okay. There we go. But first, I want to thank the Dean and her staff for pulling this together again. The first one was, when a lot of people were beginning Zoom meetings. This is as we get into it, but it's still very much needed. one of the things I want to do with my time is to kind of compare some of the past issues that I dealt with in social work to bring it up to the speed up to date to 2020, so that things can seem to be realistic of what we can do. One of the things that words that was always used, and Norm would probably remember this when we were in community organizing, was the word change agent, and that social workers needed to be change agents within our community, because our role was not only to change the lives of people by upgrading their life, but also change a lot of the policies and that were keeping them down. We really need to get involved in being a change agent right now, because if anybody looked at the news today, rightfully so, they saw that a lot of the news has switched from the social unrest and the injustice of the police department and African-American males in the Black community back to the virus. And I'm not complaining about that, because the virus is killing so many African-Americans and Hispanics also. So that's a need. But how it signals me is that unless we begin to take the social unrest movement that we have just gone through, and as social workers not begin to bring about a change as change agents to many of the policies and things, then this whole movement that's been going on for about the last month is going to be lost, because people are not going to go back out in the streets again unless there's another killing or shootings, which could happen. So right now we have to seize the time and begin to make our protest a movement, and begin to look at fundamental changes in things like the criminal justice system, and things like the legal system with laws. And we need to look at education and how education is very disproportionate based upon race and the suburbs, how the housing conditions are so deplorable. And a lot of times, part of the reason the virus is spreading is because there's not enough room for people to even distance themselves in the housing projects and in housing. And we have to look at the economic system. One of the reasons many of our low-income African Americans and Hispanics are being hurt is because they have to work in jobs where they're being really exposed to the public, because those are the low-income jobs. Healthcare, one of the problems with the virus is, diabetes, high blood pressure, things in healthcare that we don't have, and law enforcement, which basically don't respect many low-income Black folks or Hispanics, and the prison system, which is basically turned into an industry, and as you always hear people say, the judges and the police say, we got to get this person off the street. The prison system was set up for rehabilitation. You never hear anybody talk about rehabilitation and counseling anymore. It's always, let's get these thugs off the street. So these are things that we have to begin to look at. But one of the good things that I think this is going to bring about a good change is, one, nobody heard a lot about Juneteenth, and Juneteenth was in 1865, where Major Granger went into Texas and freed the last group of slaves. That was all over. Up to our last week, nobody really knew about Juneteenth. NASCAR, you have an African-American Bubba who's running the NASCAR, and I myself would have never known that we would have seen all those NASCAR drivers and people that work in the pits supporting him and walking behind his car on national TV. But, and we still have to look at the fact there's been 2 hangings. The police tried to first say it was suicide, but who commits suicide in front of 2 city halls? We've had 2 nooses. We've had 3 police officers fired in the last, I think, couple of days, because on social media, they were talking about how to kill African-American males. One of the things that brings social work home is the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore, where the African-American died in the back of a police car. But if we look at Freddie Gray's background, one, he was born to premature. His mother was strung out on drugs, so he was born a drug addict, which he had to get rid of. He was raised in low income, and most of his housing had lead paint. He had chewed on the lead paint, and none of his meals were regular, and he wasn't that great in school because of the educational system. All of those are social work terms that we need to look at. But people like that can be turned around. Let me talk about one good example, and that is when I was in New Detroit. One of my assignments was working with the street gangs, the Bishops and Chains, who were rival gangs on the east side of Detroit. Friend of mine, Bill Pickard, who has donated some money to the School of Social Work and to be putting some more together, said, Hub is my nickname. He said, let's take them over to Chicago to the Better Boys Foundation. I didn't know what the Better Boys Foundation was. Better Boys Foundation was a nonprofit organization where the Blackstone Rangers and the Devil's Disciples and all those in Chicago had been counseled, and a lot of them were now college graduates. Many of them had PhDs. Few even had McDonald's, which Bill Pickard had. And so we put two groups of street gangs on a Greyhound bus, took them to Chicago, and had all these meetings at the Malcolm X Community College. We thought our boys was turned around, but we really didn't know. And because the gang's problem was so high, they had a guy named Jim Graham, which you could look up, to work for the Detroit News. And he shadowed us. And I said, yeah, he can shadow me, but I do not need any racist, negative writers. And so Jim Graham ended up being a very positive pro-writer for the Detroit News. He was on the bus with us too. On the way back from Chicago, as many of you know, Kalamazoo, Michigan is halfway between Chicago and Detroit. We got off the Greyhound bus, myself, Bill Pickard, Jim Graham, the bus driver, and some others, and went into this little rest stop cafe to get some sandwiches and coffee. It was probably 10 o'clock at night, and we left there around 5 or 6 in the afternoon, Chicago. We get back to the Greyhound bus and the door is locked, and they wouldn't let us in. And all I could think is, damn, this thing is going to be a failure because they're going to commit mutiny. Don't know even if they know how to drive a damn Greyhound bus. And if they do, they're going to run into somebody on I-75 on the freeway going back, cause a multiple accident, and we just sitting there scratching our heads and say, here we got Jim Graham that's going to already write articles and get on the phone. We went back inside the restaurant, didn't call the police like a lot of people would have panicked and called the Kalamazoo police. We sat down for about another 15 minutes and had coffee. And one of the gang members came in and said, you guys can get on the bus now. We said, fine. We still was expecting the worst. We got on the bus and they said, we are no longer the Bishops and Chains. We are the Brotherhood. And we going back to the neighborhood to help turn other gang members around. That was really something, because then when Jim Graham called all the news media, when we pulled up on the east side of Detroit at midnight, every media outlet was there telling the story. And that turned a lot of young people around. And I give that story to be able to say that most of these young folks are looking for a family, and gangs and a lot of the negative things they do end up being their family. And for those of us that are social workers, figure out how to give them family and partnerships. So all of them won't be turned around. All of mine didn't get turned around, but a lot of them did get turned around. One of the other gang stories I have, which shows that if police officers think out of the box, a lot of relationships between police and African-American males could be formed. We took them to a camp. This in the upper Michigan. We rented a camp, and it was a really structured program. And this is something social workers can do, because we know how to structure programs. We know how to get dialogue going. So we took them, and we took the gang squad from Detroit. Coleman Young I finally had convinced him, because at first he was not even for trying to convert youth that were having problems. So he finally said, okay, he gave us 20 members of the black police officers that really wanted to turn gangs around, and they ended up being the gang squad. Anyway, we took them up north to a camp. Next thing I know, one of the police officers called me to the side. Hey, Paul, everybody's packing. And you know what packing means. It means they got a pistol. And so I said, what? He said, we can't be here if everybody's packing. He says, but we don't want to come down on them. They trust you. You need to go in there and talk to them. And he says, we will give you our word if you don't take it back to Detroit and let them know what's going on. If you can get their pistols, we'll lock them up and we'll give them back to you Sunday to give back. Now that's thinking out of the box. I really don't think there's no police officers today that would even consider something like that. I pulled the head of both gangs together, the head of the Bishops and the head of the Chains. As a matter of fact, Tommy Hearns was a member of the Bishops. And you know, as you know, he was a world champion boxer, and all that was part of our effort too, getting him in the Golden Gloves and stuff like that when he was a gangbanger. Well, they came back out and said, we're going to give you our guns, but you know what's going to happen to you if we don't get them back. I said, yeah, I know what's happening. So the police gave me a big chest. They took the guns, they put a tag on all of them and who got the guns were owned by. They put a lock on it. They showed me where they were hiding it. And we had a real good, fruitful interaction for the rest of the weekend, a discussion between, you know, young black youth and police officers, and they kind of bonded a little bit. That Sunday, I remember the police officers left at 10 o'clock after breakfast. They gave me the key and said, the chest is over there in the woods and it's this way, that way. And they left. They said, we got to go before you give it to them. So they left. I gave them all the guns back. And so it ended up being a good weekend. But I'm just talking about how sometimes you have to think out of the box to make things happen. One of the things that I've noticed, and I talked to the dean about this, is that Netflix is doing a pretty good job in uncovering what some of the problems were. But one of the problems of African-American males is I traced by looking just at a few of the Netflix things. One was called The 13th, what the dean said she knows about, because I called her right after I watched it. And she said she already knew about it. What it is the 13th Amendment that says everybody's free, but there's one line in there that says criminals are not free. And so it goes to show that at that point of how they begin to arrest African-American males and a few females, which means they're no longer free based upon the 13th Amendment. And it goes all about the whole prison system, of how the prison system not only was taking freedom away from black males, but also it goes all the way up to where it has become an industry with being privatized, with people making money. One of the other things that it shows, that I saw on Netflix, is that all of the political elections was ran on law and order, mostly in the 70s and 80s. And those were the people that got elected. And one of the things that came out was the fact that the Democratic Party, and it started with Clinton, the only way they were winning anything was to start being law and order. And that was part, because, you know, Clinton was the one that put together 3 strikes you out. He's the one that we trying to get everybody, even though he was a Democrat and I voted for him and I liked him, but he still, you know, has the baggage of the prison, of the 3 strikes you out, the whole prison situation, and things that we're trying to undo now. Then the last thing that I saw there that was really disturbing is that in Hollywood, the only films that the black actors did a very good job in the 50s and 60s. Then the film industry come out with Superfly, Shaq, and all of those which glorified gangsters. And when some of the black movie stars decided they didn't want to star in all these black roles, they wanted to do some middle-of-the-road American films and other kind of fiction, they were ostracized until Spike Lee came around. So basically what you had is people in the 80s and 90s and late 70s running on law and order as far as the political thing. At the same time, you had Hollywood and TV glorifying the whole gangster thing for black people. So that's a lot of things that got the people's subconscious, particularly black folks, basically as a way of making it. And then when Spike Lee started coming out with some just general American kinds of films and history films, then the black filmmakers started looking at things and saw where they were being accepted again. One of the stories that I had been asked to tell again was when I was in the School of Social Work at Wayne State. There was and it was the war protests, which some of our past speakers spoke to. There was the Kent State shooting. And I remember when the dean had me talk to some students before, they never heard of Kent State, where a lot of students, and mostly white, were killed and wounded by the National Guards. The National Guards actually shot up the campus. And I'm talking hundreds, not a few students were both killed. And so when I said that at Wayne State, they all got on their little cell phones like we do now with high tech. They looked it up and their mouths dropped open, their eyes wide open about Kent State. Well, Wayne State got very upset, and they should, and I was upset too. But then about a month later, the Highway Patrol shot up Jackson State, which were black students, and they killed about 9 black students, and a lot of others were wounded. And I didn't see the type of outcry. And at the time, I don't know if it was mentioned or not, I was president of the Association of Students at Wayne State. Not only was I president of the Association of Black Students, I was president of the Association of Students for the campus of Wayne State. So we decided that there was not enough passion for black students, and we were going to shut the campus down. So we had our meeting. We said we're going to shut Wayne State down. Then I think the mall's still there, but the mall there was when you always wanted together when you wanted to give a speech or pass out flyers, etc. So we were going to take over the mall. I got a call from President Keith about 7, 8 o'clock that night. President Keith said, I understand you as president of the Association of Students and Association of Black Social Work Students are going to shut my campus down. I said, yep, I'm going to shut it down. He says, meet me for breakfast in my apartment, which is the same apartment that all the other presidents have. And he says, I want you to quietly come in at 6 in the morning because it won't do me any good for my colleagues to see you coming in, and it won't do you any good for your followers to see you coming in. I said, fine. I got there about 5 minutes to 6 a.m., came in, he had breakfast brought in. He says, well, tell me what you're going to do. And I told him, he says, how would you, and I'm looking to be cussed out. He even talked about being expelled, and he had already called Dean Dillick about me on that. And he says, you know, I talked to the dean, and he says, I understand your heart's in the right place. How would you like for me to help you shut my campus down? And I just sat there with my mouth open, and I said, well, let's talk about it. He says, I have a lot of racist professors on campus. He says, and I have not been able to change a lot of the attitudes. So let's shut it down, and you give me permission to call for a teach-in. The teach-in was going to be 2 weeks. He says, and you was going to shut the campus down for 3 days. Let's do it for 2 weeks. He says, and I'll give you a $20,000 budget through the student fund. He said the teach-in would be that in math and in science and English and all of the things on campus, the professors would have to talk about the history and what black folks had to contribute to those particular courses of studies. Of course, 3/4 of the professors loved it. Then of course, a fourth didn't. Said he bowed down to me, which wasn't true. The teach-in was highly successful because even the ones that didn't want to teach it began to make it part of their curriculum. And that's what I'm talking about, going back to social work being a change agent. He got all kind of nice write-ups in the New York Times and all of being a college president that understood the times. So not only did it benefit him, and it benefited me, and he gave us $20,000. I brought in students from Jackson State that came in and spoke on the mall, and we had demonstrations, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, what I didn't say the last time I told this was that the fallout on me was the FBI. You know, I remember them calling me one morning, and the phone kept clicking off and clicking off. Then finally, they said, "This is the FBI. We don't like what you did." at Wayne State University. You reverse racism, et cetera, and we're going to come after you, but we want to interview you. So my field placement, which was lucky, was with Coleman Young, and he was state senator then. So I remember telling Coleman in Lansing that I was his legislative intern. I said, Coleman, I got to go back because the FBI wants to interview me. And I'm thinking, and everybody, the older people to know Coleman know he didn't mince his words. He said, you little young MF, I thought I taught your MF, but a lot of stuff. And you going to sit there and let them fools do it. They going to slice so many tapes. And I didn't even know anything about slicing tapes then. He said, they going to slice tapes and put stuff together that you won't even recognize the meeting, and it's going to follow you in history. He immediately got on the phone and called Marianne Mahaffey, because they were friends, and said, Marianne, you know what they're getting ready to do with Paul? They're getting ready to do, FBI is going to meet at his house. Marianne called Les Roberts, who was a very active African-American professor in the School of Social Work. And they both said, we coming to your house. And I said, fine. They came to the house 15 minutes before my interview before the FBI. When I pulled in, I saw the FBI parked out in front of my house. So then all of a sudden I get a phone call. I see you got that damn Marianne Mahaffey and Les Roberts in there. We know that Marianne Mahaffey, she's this and that, and she's this and that, and she's a nigger lover, et cetera, and that damn Coleman Young is this and that. We are not coming in this time, but you better watch yourself because we're after you. This is a true story. So they slammed the phone down. Next thing I know is I get a thing from the Internal Revenue Service indicating that I'm taking communist money, and that was the $20,000 that I used for the meeting at the mall, and none of them, and they didn't want to recognize that Dean Dillick from the university gave that to me. I'm a religious person too. I still go to Hartford even in Detroit, and I'm a trustee there. And I guess God was looking out for me, because when I got to the Internal Revenue for an interview, they said, the lady that's supposed to interview you got the flu, and we have to get somebody else. And they went and got this young lady that just happened to work for them and was kind of new. And she said, do you know why you're here? I said, no. She said, because the FBI is saying you're taking bribes from the Communist Party, and that's what you're using to do stuff on Wayne's campus. She said, she gave me her name, and she named her father, who was a preacher, who was a civil rights worker. She said, so you are my father in the same thing. She said, just like white folks take care of each other, I'm gonna take care of you. She pushed the button on the computer and said, you won't have any more problems for a while because I've cleared you for all your finances. And so all of that is really a true story. One of the other things that I want to mention, and Norm and I worked together on this, is, and there was a lot of friction between the white students and black students.
Mr. Hubbard, I'm sorry, we actually have a question related to that. So if I can circle back to that part,
okay,
if you wouldn't mind. And I apologize.
Well, would you let me finish this? Just let me finish this.
Absolutely. We'll save the question for later.
Okay, no, you can do this. All I want to say is that because of the conflict between black students and white students in the School of Social Work and on campus, and we were saying that white students didn't know black culture to work with black kids, we put together a thing called Social Work in the Black Community. I talked to Norm because Norm was president of the student body. I was his vice president, and he and I got along pretty well. So he got the white students behind it. We actually implemented as a curriculum social workers in the black community. Lonnie Peak, who some of you know, taught the particular course, and the black students who really didn't need it, but they couldn't get into the course because of the white students that were basically in there that was filling up all the slots. Basically, you know, I know I've talked about things, but there was the other thing of how money works. There was a noose in the General Motors plant down in Toledo, where I live now. General Motors didn't do anything about it. I called Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson puts out a report card every year on the automobile industry, all of them, both Japan, United States, and everybody wants this good grade on his report card. Jesse came down And as soon as General Motors found Jesse was coming down, which I called him because I know him, have worked with him in the past. As a matter of fact, he showed up at the naming of the conference room of the School of Social Work that was named after me a couple of years ago. General Motors immediately put out a $25,000 reward for who was putting up the nooses. And finally, I just like to say that there are billions of dollars that's going to be allocated for the virus, for testing, for vaccine. And I would hope that our social work agencies would begin to look at where that money is going, begin to apply for it, begin to make it. There's also going to be a lot of virus money on job retraining, and there's also going to be a lot for minority businesses. So I would hope that our social workers would, as I say, become change agents, apply for some of that money, and we should be on the forefront of doing it. Okay, sorry I took so long.
No. Thank you so much. Actually, we were going to circle back with some of the great events that our student organizations have been doing that is revisiting some of the work that you and Mr. Olshansky had laid the platform for. So hopefully we'll be able to, if we can't discuss it here, I would love to revisit with both of you what some of our student orgs, including the Association of Black Social Workers, our SWIFT team, are actually doing around some of that work. So as I turn it over to Sarah Gleischer to wrap up the panelist discussion, for those of you with questions, please begin to type those into the chat bar. I will begin to pull those things together so that we can have a Q&A with our participants. Sarah, I turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, it's kind of humbling to be with these panelists who have so much experience and histories, but I guess it's my youth. I haven't earned the stripes yet. So I'm going to follow the outline that Katie gave, and I'm going to talk fast because we need to leave time for Q&A. But what led me to social work? Social work was actually my second choice. Initially, I wanted to be a child psychologist. So after 7 years, I completed my bachelor's degree at University of Minnesota in child psychology and realized there was practically nothing I could do with that degree. And after 7 years of living in St. Paul, Minnesota, I wanted to come back to Detroit. So I looked through the Wayne State University course catalog and found the description of social work perfectly aligned with my lifelong interests in politics and social justice. I grew up in a politically active family. I also think that my lifelong hearing disability has helped me identify and have empathy with the underdog, which social work was perfect for. I applied really late in the process that year in August, and luckily the school at that time in 1981 was so desperate for students, they accepted me. It was actually Mary Ann Mahaffey that got me into the program because they needed money, but it all felt like an impulsive decision, but it ended up being the right one. At that time, like Norm mentioned, the Wayne State School of Social Work had a community organizing track, which was perfect for people who like to question authority and wanted to solve social problems to create a better world for everybody. Community organizing is really a specialized field of social work that's dedicated to restoring democracy at the grassroots level and energizing people to become more active members of their community. It focuses on bringing people together to change policies and systems and bring about meaningful change. And the whole process of community organizing is one that empowers people, especially vulnerable population. So I was asked to talk about community organizing, my work as community organizer with Healthy Dearborn, but it's important to note that I got that job at the age of 59. So all the skills and lessons gained from my previous jobs helped me succeed with Healthy Dearborn. My second job out of college was working for the late Mary Ann Mahaffey at Detroit City Council, and I worked there for 21 years. Paul mentioned her too. She was a social worker, a feminist, and a trailblazer in so many ways. Being in her office was a fantastic training ground for a community organizer and social worker. Mary Ann taught me and famous social workers like Dean Kubiak and Santil Jenkins, both of whom worked in that office, that nothing can be achieved in the way of policy and community change unless the people most affected by the issues are involved from day one in defining and in defining the problem as well as the solution. Everyone, no matter their background, ability, people with disabilities, were invited to have a seat at the table to participate and make decisions about policy and strategy. My second job was with a community mental health agency in Detroit, and that job gave me valuable experience learning how to write grants, how to direct programs, and there are directly with people who have serious mental illness and developmental disabilities, which was a great lesson in that every single person has something to contribute and give. And with them, we were able to advocate for changes in welfare and budgetary policies at the state level. My most recent job with Beaumont Health was as a community organizer, and my assignment was to create and facilitate a Healthy Dearborn Coalition aimed at preventing chronic disease at the community or population health level. There, we built a coalition of more than 500 people. It was a diverse coalition that represented the population of Dearborn, where the majority minority is Arab. With a real model of shared leadership and collective action, we won statewide recognition for a lot of the work that we did. We raised $2 million in grant funding for things like a bike share program. We developed a new neighborhood park in a low-income neighborhood, with the first park ever in the city of Dearborn to be designed by the community. We did walking, biking, a new seed library, new school curricula, healthy restaurants. And one of my favorite projects there was working with the poorest and the unhealthiest residents living in the south end of Dearborn who were concerned about air pollution. We got grant funding to start this innovative high school academy where students and their families learn how to collect and analyze air pollution data in order to advocate for changes in state laws. We were asked to identify items as a call to action. Like Paul, I feel like the call to action is seize the moment. I would encourage every single social worker to build on our strength and our core social work values to make change and get involved now, because we are in a national emergency. I think the cruelty and the violation of human rights that's happening on a daily basis due to racism, whether it's Blacks being killed by police or by health disparity or incarcerated unjustly, or whether it's refugee children being torn away from their families at the border. We need to recognize that every single one of these actions is cruel, it's unjust, and it violates the social work code of ethics. The call to action is to not become desensitized to any injustice, despite the fact that we're hearing about a new horrible practice, incident, or policy every single day. People young and old are taking bold actions, and we need to join them now. Use your skills and your energy, build bridges, advocate. I think there's 3 immediate things that each one of us can do. One is to be an active learner. I learned just by listening to the panelists today. I have learned so much in the last 2 weeks, reading from these young activists who are on the front lines of the Black Lives Matters protests. Learn everything you can. I think it's imperative for each one of us to read about and really know the history of white supremacy in this country, beginning with the annihilation of Native Americans to enslavement and lynchings of Blacks. Read, learn about, understand, and acknowledge that white supremacy exists. I mean, we are seeing it blatantly out in the open, and really dig deep to understand what your role is, what our role is currently in upholding these racist systems, and understand why it's important that these systems be dismantled. If we believe in equity, social, and racial justice, as every social worker should, then I think it just behooves us to do this work. A second call to action is to be an active listener. Identify your own personal biases and defenses. I think we all have them against any group of people, but really dig deep, identify them, and learn about them so you can set them aside so that you can really hear what others are saying. I think it's imperative that we hold ourselves accountable for our identity and our role in enabling systemic racism. And then really listen without any prejudgments, assumptions, presumptions. Acknowledge the humanity of the person you're listening to. Dig down deep and try to understand things from their perspective. Respect and really listen to the experiences, the lived experiences of people of color. And I think you can look within your own organization or your field placement or even your social network and really look at where the impact of race-based power differentials are and figure out how you can address them or even speak out about them. I think the third call to action is just identifying an organization that's doing some of the anti-racism or immigration or justice work you feel strongly about. There's so many excellent organizations. And find a way to volunteer now. Find a way to utilize your social work and other skills. Stand up, speak out. Make sure that people of color are leading and making and executing decisions at these organizations. And then as a white person, especially, ask them how you can help. I just feel like, as Paul kind of alluded to, all hands are needed on deck. We just need to find a way to be active. Advice to students based on experiences over the years. One is always be a learner. Like I said, every minute of life, there's so much to learn. It involves watching, listening, observing, and asking questions. I think for young social workers, you will find that there are people at your field placement or place of work who will be happy to answer your questions and share their knowledge and expertise. And I think it's also important to remember that you will learn as much from the people you're serving as the people you're working with. So really be deliberate in listening and learning from everyone and allow people to have the opportunity to share their expertise with you. Constantly seek out information on how you can do your job better. There's a wealth of resources available. I think the second lesson learned, and this is hard work, is just reflect. Really do that internal work of knowing and understanding yourself. Know what it is that make you respond and react the way you do. Really look at the experiences in your life and how those experiences have led to make you have those responses to things, and know what you have to do to change those responses and learn from them. Third piece of advice, never burn bridges. Oh my God, treat everybody with respect, even if you don't like them, even if you don't disagree with them. You will be so surprised how often you will run into people later in your life and career and you'll need their support in some way. And you will be so grateful that you didn't piss them off earlier. I think you'll also be pleasantly surprised how much you actually agree and like that person once you open your mind to them. Fourth piece of advice, don't go it alone. Learn to share information and leadership too, so that everybody is working in concert toward a common goal, and so that everybody can gain skills and build collective action and build collective strength. And I think it's important to cede power to others with the lived experiences that you do not have. Fifth, identify mentors. Ask questions and learn from them. Mentors, the importance of mentors just cannot be overstated. I would say sixth, learn about grant writing. Grants are a way to get resources that every marginalized community needs. I think 7, be the social worker that you would want. Never see the person that you're serving or the person using services as the other. Think about the interactions you have and how you would change them if you were the one receiving them. If you leave at the end of every day knowing that you did your best and you treated everybody else the way you would want to be treated, I think your life will be much more rewarding. And last, I would say just be patient and respect process. Give yourself time to learn about your new job, organization, community. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable and be comfortable with not knowing everything. be comfortable with finding somebody to ask questions about, and be patient with the time it takes to achieve meaningful change. It takes time, and so many things will change along the way. You have to be adaptable and flexible, but if you have clear goals, a clear aim, and you are really genuinely working with others on the same aim, not going it alone, you will succeed. It may take time, but you'll get there. I'm going to stop, leave time for others. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you. And I thank you all as our panelists for joining us. I have been gathering questions from our chat. And the first question up, Sarah, actually goes to you. So the question is, how do you sustain your activist organizer spirit?
Oh, God. I just think, how do you sustain it? I think you just draw energy and inspiration from the people you're working with. There's certainly enough issues and problems, and as a social worker, we want to solve them all. So I think the energy and just the excitement comes from people that you're working with, and you just, yeah. I mean, other people are just as excited and wanting to change the world as you too. So it's a matter of finding them and working with them and staying passionate.
Well, a good part of maintaining and keeping the spirit goes is to be able to look at the injustice things that are happening in society, and also understand that everything goes in a cycle. If you look at history, just about all the social injustices keep going in a cycle about every 40 to 50 years. And so if you take a look at it, you see how things are solved. As a matter of fact, as I said in some of the meetings, listening to some of the young Black folks talk about the social unrest, is almost verbatim of what was going on when I was younger at their age. I mean, to the word is verbatim. So most of it is just looking at the unjust thing, but understanding that change can be made. People lose a lot of motivation if change can't be made, or if what they do is in a box. But to know the changing can be made keeps your spirit going.
Another way to deal with it is to think of yourself as a long distance runner. Michael Harrington would talk about what it takes to be committed as an activist. You have to have the long view and not get discouraged when you have short defeats. Be a long distance runner.
You know, I just want to add too that what is really exciting, maybe some of the same messages and tactics are recycled, but I have found what's really exciting over the last couple of weeks is these young activists that are leading the Black Lives Matters and sustaining these protests. They're so much more sophisticated, I think, than the people of my generation when we were protesting. They're so much more sophisticated. They are so much clearer on what they want to have change. I find that to be really exciting and inspiring. Change, undoing 400 years of racism is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, but I just find so much inspiration from that energy.
Thank you, thank you. So the next question that we have speaks to how we can change attitudes and mobilize our peers to be more active in the community. And I think this speaks to what Mr. Paul and Mr. Norman did as students originally at the School of Social Work. What were some of those one or two key takeaways of how you were able to influence other people to become active?
First, let me just say I'm going to apologize ahead of time that I'm going to have to leave the program in about 10 minutes because of another Zoom obligation. But to your question, you know, part of it is listening to people, asking people for input, helping them to feel that you really care about what they're saying and that your agenda is not more important than their agenda or interests. And then it's a question of not letting any one person dominate a group, because that often happens. Sometimes it can be the leader, other times it can be another participant. So if you're really going to be a good facilitator to bring people together and to help them mobilize, then you have to be a good gatekeeper and to manage the group in a way that you are really listening to them, appreciating what they say, giving good reflective feedback so they know you've heard them, and being empathetic to their positions.
Yeah, and you know, one major thing is you're not always going to be able to change people's personal attitude and personal philosophy, but you can change the way they do things. And the way you change the way they do things, even if they have in the back of their mind, they still believe in what they believe. One, you find common ground. And one way of finding common ground was like the social work in the Black community. I don't believe that we changed a lot of the basic philosophies of the white students, but when they started finding out that, well, the Black social workers don't want them in Black field placements in the community, but if we take this course, we understand the culture, and then we can go ahead and be able to do the work that we need to do. And Norm was very supportive of that. That was a way of finding common ground for everybody. So a lot of times you don't necessarily have to work on trying to change what's up there, but change how people do things and how they react to things.
Curious that you used common ground as the metaphor.
You're right. And I got your chat box, Norm, and I agree with everything. Thanks. He and I have been exchanging private chat box.
Thank you both. And this next question is about a shift in social work. So do you see a shift in social work, whether that be our professional obligation or even the way we educate future social workers with the current social justice movement that's going on right now? Is there a shift or is there a need for a shift?
Well, I think there's a need for a shift to get back to people becoming change agents. I can say that a lot of the social work situations, people have begun to take more of a job as opposed to an advocate. And so we need to kind of begin to shift back that if you're going to be in this particular job, you need to be able to be in there with passion and to be an advocate as well as looking to get paid and not just a 9-to-5 job. And I see it shifting back to that. I mean, this roundtable and other roundtable is just part of showing us to shift back. And, you know, I've had some conversations with the dean about this, and she's talked about other things. You know, for instance, I've said we don't have any more Betty Phillips, Marianne Mahaffey's, and Les Roberts as professors in the School of Social Work anymore. And when she and I have had those talks, she's basically agreed with me, but defended her staff by saying, yeah, but they got to write books now. They got to go after grants, and they got to do a lot more things than maybe a lot of the professors did when you were in school. So we have to look at those kinds of things, and times have changed. Everything is more high tech. There's social media. So we have to figure out how to begin to use all of those types of things, which takes less physical involvement, but still get some of the things accomplished that's for the people that we're supposed to serve, such as prison reform, health change, having an impact on education, et cetera. And one good thing, mention education, is we have to look at, you know, I was looking at some statistics of how African-American students get more days out of school of being expelled and more days out of different classes being expelled is almost 50% more than white students. So if you feel for the same punishment within schools, African-American students are getting punished 50% the rate of whites. That's something that school social workers and people could start advocating about.
One of the things, I don't know if it's different now in Detroit or where other people live that are on this Zoom meeting, but where I am, you never hear about social workers leading movements now. It's the lawyers, it's the academics, and I think that's one of the things that our skill sets, our empathy, our understandings of human behavior, our understanding of organizing theory, group process, all of those things are the very skills that make for good change agents. And we need to put more emphasis on that and bring more social workers into the realm of being activists no matter where they sit in the social service nonprofit sector.
I would just echo what Norm said. If we look at our history, social work history, the social workers who were involved in reform movements, a lot of social workers were involved in the women's movements, women's suffrage, unions, health and safety issues. So we have a legacy of Settlement House. So we need to remind ourselves what that history was and to draw lessons from that and be inspired by the struggles that they carried out.
Well, one of the examples I used when I spoke with the social work students about a year ago, I spoke with the leadership of the students in the School of Social Work. And the example I used right quick, I said, all of you feel good about feeding the homeless and collecting food and clothes and going down there. But as social workers, we need to do that. But we also need to be change agents to change the state budget, the city budget, so that we can give the mental health counseling, job counseling, so that we don't have homeless. So it's good to feed them, but we also need to be change agents to make the budgets and the policies where we can bring them out of that particular state of life they're in.
Thank you. So we have a couple of concluding comments. Well, one concluding comment, and then, well, I thought I was unmuted and then muted myself again. My apologies. So I have one concluding comment, and then I will be turning it over to another special guest that we have for concluding thoughts in our Wayne State response to some of the things that we are dealing with in our society. So the concluding thought, there was some chatter on the chat box about the School of Social Work working with other disciplines or across campus, specifically the law school, around some interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary trainings related to criminal justice reform and some of the systemic issues that we see around prison pipeline, school to prison pipeline concerns, as well as some of the inequities around some of our prison time. So there are a couple of things that the School of Social Work is doing. One is directly housed in our center, where we are intentionally training social workers, those in law school and other departments, around what this focus around interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teamwork when working with individuals around reentry, but also working on how do we put comprehensive programming in place. Another thing that we've also implemented is a minor at the undergraduate level, so that we're allowing our social work students to have these intentional exposures outside of the school. So with that, I want to turn it over for concluding thoughts from one of my colleagues here at the school, at the university, the Assistant Director at the Office of Multicultural and Student Engagement here at Wayne State, Mrs. Stephanie Hawks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. As Takesha said, I'm Stephanie Hawks, and I work as the Assistant Director for the Office of Multicultural Student Engagement here at Wayne State. And for those of you who have not heard of us, hello. The office is new to Wayne State as of 2015, so we are a newer office in terms of being established on campus. And I just wanted to share a few things that we are doing in response not only to COVID, but just our general purpose when we're not responding to a pandemic, race or health related. And so our office exists to make sure that students, undergraduate and graduate students, feel valued, welcomed, and respected and heard during their time and during their studies here at Wayne State. Ordinarily, we are housed on the 7th floor of the Student Center, but obviously in virtual times, we're everywhere. We're all around you. And so I just wanted to share a few things that our office does. So we do have 2 learning communities, one for self-identified women of color called PRISE, and the network, which is for African-American men. And through those programs, we offer mentorship, workshops, just bonding sessions, so that as we understand students of color, we're not really welcomed in terms of how universities were built and established. So we provide kind of that wraparound support to increase retention efforts around African-American men and self-identified women of color. Our office also does workshops and trainings for student organizations. So I know there are some people here who are representing some of the student orgs in social work. And so we'd be happy to partner with you if there are ways for us to support what you as an org are working towards. And lastly, we have been doing a number of sessions throughout this summer in response to just racism, and as people have said during this session, civil unrest. And so it's our What's Going On session. I'll drop it in the chat. But my philosophy as assistant director within OMSI is that social justice, equity, and inclusion is everyone's job and part of everyone's experience. And so when we start siloing things off, where we start looking to individuals as experts or, you know, point people, the work starts getting bogged down because obviously people get overworked, we can't reach everybody. And so I'm operating these systems from the space that everyone has knowledge and truths, and everyone has something they're passionate about that can then lead to educating others. So we are obviously still in June. So if you go to our main website, there are a few sessions left for June. But I've been reaching out to colleagues who I know have a vested interest in some of these topics, just to speak on things as just a person. And so these sessions are open to faculty, staff, students, and alum. At this time, we're not really opening them up to the broader community because we do have capacity limits in Zoom. And so we want to make sure that our seats are going to people who are attending or working at Wayne State for now. But those are new to our office. As a side note, this does not have to do with our office, but I was inspired to share this based on the conversation. So the Reuther Library is actually doing a community archive on COVID-19 experiences. And so in line with the theme of today of, you know, I think it was looking back and forward, but history, we're talking about history, and obviously we're living, every day is history, but right now feels very historic. And so as social workers, as students, as leaders, it might be valuable for us to continue to contribute towards making history and documenting history. And so they're looking specifically for like letters or photos or just any type of thing to document what COVID has looked like for Detroiters, for Black Detroiters, for the Metro Detroit area. And so even though that doesn't necessarily tie to our direct office, again, we all have something to offer, contribute. And so this might be a really cool opportunity for people across campus and within this college to contribute to kind of making history. So I think that was all I wanted to say. We do plan to continue the sessions for What's Going On into August, halfway through August, but you know, stay tuned on our website for the calendar, and I do send them out to your marketing coordinator, so hopefully those get sent out to you as well. So I'll conclude there, but thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. It's always great to know what is happening on our campus. And you have such a great pulse on so many things that have been happening over the last couple of months. So I appreciate you being here. To our panelists, thank you so much for joining us. For me, it's always great to move away from an educator role to be able to sit and hear from those that are the experts. And so I thank you. I appreciate your words. I appreciate you joining us. To our SWIFT programming board, Andre, Colleen, Alexis, Amani, Logan, Marshall, and Raj. Thank you for developing the thoughts behind this, for recognizing that it was needed within the school, within our student body, and for bringing that to our administrators' attention so that they could give you a platform to share this. So we appreciate your hard work. And I thank everyone for spending an extra few minutes with us. I definitely lose track of time when I get excited listening and learning. So this was an absolutely wonderful session, and I look forward to an opportunity to invite you all back for future discussions. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Much appreciated. And everybody have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.